It was the middle of September 2019, and I had just turned 31. I remember that year clearly because I had taken a break from everything. No work, no girlfriend, no calls, no social media. Just me, my truck, and the outdoors. I was from northern Georgia, but I had always wanted to explore more of Alabama. I had this old map I picked up at a flea market, and it showed a spot in the Talladega National Forest that looked good for camping. Off trail, deep in the woods, no people. That's what I was after. I packed up my stuff: tent, food, water, a couple flashlights, extra batteries, first aid kit, camping stove, some basic tools, and my old .38 snub revolver. I always took it with me, not because I expected trouble, but because I liked being prepared. You're alone in the woods. Things happen. You hear sounds. Sometimes you want peace of mind more than anything else. It was a Wednesday when I drove out there. I stopped in this small gas station near Heflin to fuel up, grabbed a coffee, and double-checked the directions I scribbled down from the map. The lady at the register looked like she wanted to say something when she saw where I was pointing, but she didn't. I didn't ask either. The road was rough. After a while, pavement turned into gravel, then gravel turned into dirt, and finally it was just me and some tire ruts surrounded by thick trees on both sides. I drove until I found this clearing by an old rusted sign barely hanging on one hinge. Couldn't read it. Looked like it used to be something official decades ago. Just behind that area, the trees thinned out again and the map showed a wide flat space. I hiked about 20 minutes and found it, perfect for setting up a tent. No one would find me there, but what I didn't realize, until I set up camp and walked around, was that just about 100 yards further east, there were the remains of some old sawmill. Not much left, just a half-collapsed roof, some rotted-out machinery, twisted steel beams, a pile of rusted tools, and broken crates. I guessed it had been shut down for at least 50 years, maybe more. It was weird how none of that showed on the map, but that's how it is with those old ones. Still, I didn't think much of it, just some forgotten piece of the past. I set up camp closer to the trees and further from the structure. That night, I cooked some sausages and beans, sat by the fire, and listened to the night. Crickets, a few owls, nothing unusual. But I remember, right before I went into my tent, hearing a thud, just one, dull and short. I stopped, flashlight in hand, scanned the woods, looked toward the sawmill. Nothing moved. I figured it might have been a pine cone dropping or something shifting as the air cooled. It was silent after that. I climbed in and went to sleep. Next morning was normal. Cold coffee, oatmeal, took a long walk down an old game trail. I kept my compass with me, but didn't go far. When I came back, I checked out the sawmill again. I walked carefully, watching where I stepped. The place had this eerie stillness to it, like it hadn't seen a person in decades. Sawdust still clung to the floor in spots. One of the rusted machines looked like it was made to cut whole logs. Another one, some conveyor belt, was cracked in half. In one corner of the structure was a hole in the floor where a hatch used to be. Looked like there was a crawl space or storage area below, but the wood around it had collapsed, and I wasn't dumb enough to try climbing down. I moved on, took a few photos with my phone, then headed back. That second night, I built a slightly bigger fire, cooked rice and tuna, and sat for a while, thinking about nothing. But then I started hearing something odd. Not an animal, not whine through trees. More like metal shifting, like something dragging. It came from the direction of the sawmill. It didn't last long, just a few seconds, then gone. I waited. Light from the fire flickered off the trunks of the trees. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight and gun, and walked a little closer to the edge of the clearing. Didn't see anything. I told myself, maybe old metal shifted as the air got cold again. That happens. But my gut didn't like it. That night, I kept the gun inside the tent, fully loaded, safety on. I didn't sleep great. Every twig snap sounded louder than it should have. I woke up every hour, I didn't want to leave yet, but something started to feel off. Next morning, I walked back to the sawmill just to clear my head and check things out in daylight. When I got there, I noticed footprints, old boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were newer. I wear a size 12 and these were smaller. Maybe size 9 or 10. I crouched down and looked closer. Not just one set, two. One had a different tread pattern. I looked around, listened. Silence. That's when I saw something else. One of the old broken crates I had seen the day before was now turned over. I was sure it hadn't been like that before. I would have noticed. I'm a careful person. Nothing was inside it, just wood rot and dirt. But still, someone had been there. While I was asleep, while I had walked off, I started to get uneasy. I turned around, walked straight back to camp, packed everything into my bag except the tent, and loaded it into the truck. I figured I'd stay one more night but sleep in the truck bed instead, just in case. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. I sat in the back of the truck with my sleeping bag rolled out, flashlight and revolver within reach. For the first few hours, nothing happened. It was quiet. Then, at some point after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, coming from the direction of the sawmill. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then they stopped. I sat up, didn't move, didn't make a sound. I aimed the flashlight toward the trees but saw nothing. Then I heard them again, only now they were circling. Whoever it was, they were walking in a wide loop around my camp. I stayed still, kept the gun in my hand. I wasn't about to yell or shine the light around like some horror movie idiot. I just waited, listened. The footsteps got closer, then stopped again. And then, from behind a tree maybe 20 feet away, I heard breathing. I'm not even kidding. Slow, steady, human breathing. I raised the flashlight and turned it on, bright as hell. Hit the tree. Nothing. But just behind it, I caught a quick glimpse of someone stepping behind another trunk. Too fast to see much, but they were there. I called out once. Nothing aggressive, just loud enough to let them know I wasn't helpless. No answer, no sound. I kept the light on that spot for a long time. Eventually, I turned it off to conserve batteries, but I didn't sleep. I sat up all night with my back against the cab, gun across my lap. No more footsteps, no more breathing, just the endless chirping of crickets and the occasional crack of wood in the fire pit. When the sun came up, I didn't waste time. I threw the tent into the truck bed without folding it, slammed everything into gear, and drove. On the way out, I saw something hanging on the same rusted sign I had passed when I first arrived. It was a strip of torn denim tied around the corner. Faded, frayed, knotted like a ribbon. I hadn't noticed it before. I don't know who had been out there, or why they were sneaking around the sawmill and my camp in the middle of the night. But I know they weren't camping. They weren't lost. They had boots, they knew how to move quietly, and they didn't want to be seen. I drove straight to the nearest town, found a diner, and sat there for hours with 3 cups of coffee just trying to calm down. I didn't tell anyone. Not the waitress, not the guy behind the counter. What was I supposed to say? I haven't been camping alone since that trip. Not in the deep woods anyway. I still go out sometimes, but only to well-known parks. Places with people. Places with rangers. It's not because I'm scared of the woods. It's because I'm scared of the people who hide in them, and what they're doing when they think no one's watching. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 29 at the time. I had recently quit a sales job in Raleigh, North Carolina, and hadn't lined up anything else yet. I needed to clear my head. I'd saved up enough to take some time off, and I decided to spend a few weeks just moving around the state with my gear. I'd always enjoyed camping alone. It let me reset and after the years I'd spent behind a desk, I was itching to get away from everything familiar. Most of the places I camped were just state parks or places near rivers, the kind of spots you could hike into with some effort. But during the second week of my trip, I started getting bored of the usual spots. I wanted something different. I wasn't looking for anything crazy, just a place off the beaten path. I remembered a conversation I'd overheard once about a hilltop cemetery near a small place called White Level. It wasn't anything big. It wasn't even on most maps. Apparently, the cemetery was old and forgotten, sitting way out on private land that hadn't been used in years. The kind of spot that didn't see much foot traffic. That's what caught my attention. I drove into White Level late in the day and parked about a mile from where I thought the cemetery might be. There wasn't much in the town. Just a few homes, some spread out fields, and a closed-down gas station with cracked windows. I double-checked my backpack, filled with water, food, a tarp, a light sleeping bag, and a headlamp. I had my knife and small hatchet, plus an old army surplus poncho that had saved me during more than one storm. I'd marked the route on an offline map, but the land around the cemetery was mostly overgrown with thick brush, and the dirt road that used to lead there was blocked by a downed tree. I left the car where it wouldn't be seen from the road and hiked the rest of the way in. Took me about an hour and a half of slow hiking to find it. The graveyard sat at the top of a hill surrounded by dying trees and overgrown grass. It wasn't big, maybe 30 or 40 headstones, all weathered and uneven. Some had fallen over completely. The fence that used to surround it had mostly collapsed, and the old gate hung sideways, swinging a little in the light breeze. There were broken beer bottles in one corner, maybe from teenagers or hunters passing through, but no real sign of recent use. No trash, no tire tracks. Felt like no one had been up there in a long time. The sun was dropping fast, and the light turned everything into that yellow-orange glow that makes shadows stretch out across the ground. I picked a flat area near the base of a dead tree and laid down my tarp and sleeping bag. I wasn't planning on building a fire. It didn't feel right in a place like that. I just wanted a quiet night. Maybe that was a dumb idea. I ate a cold sandwich from my pack, drank a little water, and just sat there for a while, leaning back against the tree and watching the sky darken. You could see the stars clearly from up there. There were no lights, no engines in the distance, no planes, nothing. Just wind and bugs and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the brush. I remember thinking it was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I didn't sleep right away. I rarely do the first night in a new spot. Instead, I lay in the bag, watching the tree branches above shift back and forth. Around midnight, I finally started to doze off. I think I was asleep for maybe an hour when I woke up suddenly. Not from a sound, just a feeling, like my body knew something wasn't right. I lay there for a while, eyes wide, ears straining. I heard the wind, faint as ever, and the occasional creak of branches. But underneath that, I caught something else. A soft shuffle, like grass being pressed down by feet, but slow, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed still, breathing shallow through my nose, and reached slowly for the knife I kept near my pack. The sound stopped. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Then I heard it again, off to my left. A footstep. Definitely a footstep. I turned my head slowly in that direction. The moon was out, casting just enough light to see shapes. And I saw one. A figure. Not close, but definitely human, standing halfway between me and the old fence line, barely more than a silhouette. I thought maybe it was a hunter, or someone who'd come up here to do something illegal and hadn't expected to find anyone else around. But the figure wasn't moving, just standing, watching. That was what got to me.
No flashlight, no noise.
Just standing there in the open. I stayed still and didn't say a word. I didn't want to startle him. I didn't want him to think I was a threat. I thought maybe if I didn't move, he'd go away. But then he took a step closer. I sat up slowly, making sure he could see my hands. I even raised one hand just slightly, hoping it would show I wasn't trying to cause trouble. But he didn't respond. Another step. Then he stopped again. I wasn't going to wait to see what he wanted. I rolled up onto one knee, slipped the knife into my belt, and grabbed my bag. I didn't bother with the sleeping gear. I just stood and backed away slowly, moving toward the far side of the hill. I didn't turn my back to him. When I glanced back once more, he was gone. I stopped, waited, listened. Nothing, just the trees and wind again. I moved down the hill slowly, flashlight off. I didn't want to be a glowing target in the dark. I figured I could put some distance between us and maybe find another spot deeper into the woods. But I didn't get far. Maybe 10 minutes down the hill, I heard something else. A metallic sound like a chain link clinking. I froze. The sound came again. Then a creak, like an old hinge moving slowly. The only thing with a hinge up there was the broken graveyard gate. I turned around and climbed a low rise to see back toward the hilltop. Nothing. The graveyard looked the same, but something didn't feel right. I waited.
Knees bent.
Breath slow. That's when I saw movement again. This time, two figures. One standing. One crouching near the tree I had been sleeping under. They weren't talking.
No lights.
Just moving slowly, like they were searching. I didn't wait to see more. I dropped low and moved quickly into the thicker brush, staying quiet. I got scratched by branches and thorns, but I kept going. I didn't look back again. I must have hiked for another hour before I found a shallow gully with enough cover to feel safe. I got down there and didn't even try to sleep. I just crouched in the mud and waited for the sky to lighten. The sun took forever to rise. My legs ached, and I kept jerking awake whenever my head nodded down. Around 6, with light finally pushing through the trees, I made my way back in the direction of my car. I circled wide around the graveyard, keeping my distance. I didn't want to run into anyone who might still be there. When I finally reached the road, I felt the first real wave of relief. My car was where I'd left it. I got in fast and drove away without even checking my mirrors until I was a few miles out. I didn't call the police. I didn't have enough to tell them. No one hurt me. I didn't see anything clearly. I camped where I wasn't supposed to be. I figured it would be better to just leave it alone. I drove straight back to Raleigh and stayed at my brother's place for a few nights. I didn't even unpack. I kept thinking about those two figures. What were they doing up there? Why no lights? No talking? Why were they searching my spot? It's been years since that night. I haven't camped alone since. I still love the outdoors, but I stick to campgrounds now. Somewhere with people nearby. Somewhere with cameras. Somewhere that feels safe. That graveyard wasn't haunted. There weren't any ghosts, but what I saw was worse than anything made up. It was real. Just people, just men. But whatever they were doing up there, it wasn't innocent. They weren't hikers. They weren't campers. They were there for something else. And they didn't expect me. If I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't left my gear behind, I don't know what would have happened. But I got out, and I won't ever go back. I was 34 the summer I decided to spend a week alone camping in southern Utah. It was late July of 2017, and I'd been burned out from work. I just quit my job at a design firm in Salt Lake City, and before figuring out what was next, I wanted to clear my head. I didn't want noise. I didn't want my phone. I wanted silence and long, dry desert air and the kind of peace that only came from being absolutely alone. I'd camped before, mostly forest sites in Idaho, sometimes out near the Tetons, but this time I was going deeper into the desert, somewhere unfamiliar. I picked a place far from the big parks, a plateau called Drywolf Mesa. southeast of Escalante. It wasn't part of a tourist circuit, but I found it in a forum where someone mentioned it was untouched and brutally quiet. That's what I wanted. I packed light but smart. My old 4-person tent, a new water filter system, a loaded pack with essentials, a revolver I'd taken from my father's old house, and a satellite phone I rented last minute just in case. I told my younger brother I'd check in with him after the trip and gave him the map coordinates. After that, I drove 5 hours south on Highway 89, then spent another 2 hours weaving down gravel and dirt roads until I couldn't go any farther. I parked the Jeep under a stubby pinyon tree and started hiking with my pack. The land was sun-cracked and wild. High canyon rims, dry washes, red dust, and the smell of sage in the wind. It was lonely country, like walking on the surface of another planet. I hiked until I found a flat shelf above a dry creek, about 2 miles from where I'd parked, then set up camp. The first 2 days were perfect. I didn't see another soul. I didn't hear engines or phones or people, just birds and the occasional rustle of brush in the breeze. I filtered water from a trickle that came down the rocks, cooked canned beans and jerky on a little stove, and slept under skies so wide and starry it made me feel microscopic. I took long hikes during the day, carefully tracking my path with flagging tape tied to bushes so I could find my way back. I saw some deer tracks, maybe some coyote scat, but nothing threatening. I didn't even carry the revolver most of the time, but something changed on the third night. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. Not to a sound, not to a light, just a feeling. My eyes opened and I was wide awake, like I'd been pulled out of a dream with my chest tight and my skin cold. I sat up inside the tent. Everything outside was dead quiet, not even the wind. I unzipped the tent a few inches and peeked out. The desert was black and still. My fire had gone out. The stars were clouded over. I thought maybe a coyote had wandered close and that's what woke me up. I stayed awake another half hour, just listening. But there was nothing. The next morning, I found something strange. About 20 yards from my tent, I saw prints in the dirt. Human boots. Not mine. The treads were different, deeper and narrower. At first I thought maybe I'd walked there the day before and forgot. But I followed them and they came from nowhere, then disappeared near the creek bed. No vehicle, no trail. Just maybe 8 or 9 heavy steps pressed into the dust and then nothing. I stood there for a long time staring at them. My gut started turning. I went back to camp and unpacked the revolver. Loaded it. I didn't want to leave yet. I told myself maybe a rancher passed through. Maybe a hunter. But it didn't sit right with me. Whoever it was walked in and walked out quietly at night and didn't leave a trail. That meant they were either being careful or they were used to moving like that. That whole day I couldn't settle. I stayed close to camp. I didn't hike. I kept checking the tree line. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept the revolver in my hand inside the sleeping bag. I thought maybe I'd imagined the prints. Maybe it was a trick of the light. The next morning, I found something worse. The tape I'd tied on my hiking route was gone. Every piece of it. I tied 6 or 7 strips on my loop 2 days before. Bright orange trail tape. All of them were gone. Not broken or blown off, gone. Like someone had come and peeled each one off deliberately. I checked again. Hiked the trail I'd taken. Not a single scrap left. That trail was how I knew I'd get back to my Jeep. If someone had removed those on purpose, it meant they wanted me to get lost. I felt it in my stomach again. That twisting fear that keeps your mouth dry. I packed my gear that afternoon. I wasn't going to stay any longer. I figured I could retrace my steps back to the Jeep by the terrain. I had my map and I had a pretty good sense of direction. But when I got to where I thought I'd parked, I couldn't find it. The landscape was playing tricks on me. The ridges and washes started to blur together. I climbed one bluff after another, scanning below for the pinyon tree I'd parked under. Nothing. I spent 4 hours trying to locate it. The sun was going down fast, and the heat was cooking me from the inside. I had enough water for the night, but I felt it, panic creeping in like a slow leak. I set up my tent again in a higher spot and watched the basin below through my binoculars. I was too afraid to light a fire. I chewed some jerky and drank a little water. I tried the satellite phone, but the signal kept blinking in and out. Couldn't get a lock. That night, I stayed awake listening. Just after midnight, I saw a light. A small, pale light moving through the lower part of the canyon. Not firelight too steady, like a flashlight or a headlamp. It was maybe 300 yards away, moving slowly between the rocks. I watched it for 15 minutes. Then it turned off. I didn't sleep at all. I sat there gripping the revolver, heart thumping in my ears. No sound came, just the feeling that something was nearby, something watching. In the morning, I made a new plan. I marked my camp on the GPS and started hiking in a wide spiral to find the Jeep. I hiked all morning. Around noon, I found something that made my heart stop. Boot prints again. Same tread as before. But this time, they circled around a rock ledge and led straight to a small flat spot where ashes from a fire pit sat cold. Someone else had been camping nearby recently, and they'd left no sign except the coals and those boots. I followed the prints a little farther and found something else. An empty can of beans, the same brand I was eating. The label had been peeled and the can smashed flat. That night I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human, crunching softly in the gravel near my tent. They came from the dark and stopped about 15 feet away. I held my breath, revolver ready. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then they backed away, quiet, deliberate. I waited another hour, then opened the tent slowly and looked out. There was nothing, but when I checked in the morning, there were prints, clear as day. Same boots, same pattern. Someone was walking up to my tent in the middle of the night and watching me. That was it. I left camp with just my pack and water and hiked without stopping. I went north. I didn't care about the Jeep. I just wanted to find a road, a town, anything. I rationed my water and checked my GPS every few minutes, praying the signal would hold. After 6 hours, I finally saw something. A dusty trail cut into the hillside and a ranch fence running alongside it. I followed it another mile and reached a dirt road. A truck passed half an hour later. I flagged it down with everything I had. A rancher in his 60s picked me up. I didn't tell him everything, just that I got lost and needed help. He drove me back to his place, gave me water, and let me use his landline to call my brother. We picked up the Jeep together the next day. When we got there, the Jeep was untouched. No scratches, no broken windows, but all the flagging tape was on the hood. Every piece I'd tied, folded and laid in a neat stack like someone was leaving a message. I never went back to that canyon. Whatever was out there, whoever was out there, was used to being alone. They moved without a sound, erased trails, and didn't want company. And I don't think they wanted me to leave, but I did. I got out because I didn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I got out because I didn't pretend it was nothing. Now, when I think about that week, I don't think about the stars or the quiet. I think about those boot prints in the dark, the light in the canyon, the tape on my hood, and I don't go camping alone anymore. It was early September of 2016 when I went on a solo camping trip in southern France. I had just turned 29 that summer. I worked as a freelance graphic designer based in Dublin, and after a year of barely leaving my apartment, I decided to take a long break.
No screens.
No cities, just trees, dirt, and air. I picked a quiet spot near the Tarn River, close to a small town called Ambiolay. It wasn't too popular with tourists. There were some marked hiking paths and a few old stone bridges from medieval times, but it wasn't like the Alps or the Riviera. That's why I liked it. Felt hidden. I flew into Toulouse and rented a cheap hatchback. It took me about 3 hours to drive east along winding rural roads. The land was hilly and green. Old farmhouses dotted the hills, and you'd go for miles without seeing another car. By the time I pulled off onto the dirt path that led to my planned campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. I had scouted the spot on Google Maps weeks before. It was tucked along the riverbank, past a small clearing. I liked that it was far enough from any roads that no one would casually stumble across it, but not so deep in the woods that I'd get lost. I parked just off the gravel and loaded my pack. It took about 15 minutes to hike in. The trail was barely a trail, more like a game trail or old footpath. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky was orange and pink, and the sounds of birds and insects had started to rise. The place was perfect, flat with soft grass and space between the trees. Just past it was the river, wide and slow, with banks lined by tall reeds. I pitched my tent and set up camp with no issues. Cooked some canned lentils over my small stove, drank a beer, sat on a log and watched the stars come out. I slept well that first night. No strange sounds, no animals poking around, just the soft rustle of wind in the trees. The second day I spent hiking. I had downloaded a few trails to my phone and followed one that led to a stone arch about 5 kilometers away. I didn't see a single person on the trail, just birds and bugs and the occasional snake darting through dry grass. I ate lunch on a ridge overlooking the valley and was back at my tent by late afternoon. That evening I swam in the river to cool off. The current was light, the water crisp. Afterward I dried off on the rocks, read a paperback book, and cooked a basic dinner. Again, no problems, no signs of anyone else nearby. But on the third day, things started to feel off. I woke up to the sound of branches cracking somewhere in the woods. It was early, maybe just after 6, and still dim. I sat up in my tent and listened. It wasn't loud, just 1 or 2 snaps. Not close, but not far either. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe wild boar. I had read that boars lived in this part of France. They usually kept to themselves, but they could be dangerous if cornered. I made a bit of noise when I stepped outside, hoping to scare off anything nearby. I didn't see or hear anything after that. Later that day, while exploring upriver, I thought I saw someone in the trees across the water. It was just a flash of movement, gray or tan clothing, maybe. Could have been anything. I paused, squinting across the wide stream. The opposite bank was dense with reeds and shadowed trees, and whatever I had seen was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. But that evening, when I returned to camp, I found something that made me pause. My folding knife, which I always kept in a side pocket of my backpack, was lying open on the log by the fire pit. I froze when I saw it. My bag had been zipped shut when I left. I was sure of that. I always closed it tight to keep bugs out. I didn't leave the knife out. I never did. It wasn't something you'd forget, especially on a solo trip. I picked it up, looked around, and felt a heavy silence fall over the clearing. Everything looked the same. Tent was untouched. Food bag was hanging from the tree where I'd left it. But the knife was enough to shake me. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made my heart pound. The wind, the trees creaking, the crack of twigs. I kept the knife in my hand under my sleeping bag and laid there for hours, staring at the tent ceiling. The next morning, I found footprints. They were faint, but I saw them clearly in the soft dirt just beyond the clearing, near the trees. Adult-sized, boot prints. Not mine. My boots left a different pattern, and I hadn't walked over there since setting up. They led toward the river, then stopped. I stood there for a long time, just listening. I didn't hear anything. I decided to stay one more night. I should have packed up and left. That would have been smart, but something in me wanted to hold on. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. I had spent 3 nights alone without trouble, and part of me thought maybe I had just been careless with the knife. Maybe the tracks were old. Maybe they were mine and I didn't realize it. I stayed close to camp that day. Didn't hike. I kept my knife in my pocket and a hatchet strapped to my side. I barely ate. I sat in the clearing for hours, just watching the trees, looking for movement. Around dusk, I thought I saw the man. He was across the river again, standing just inside the tree line. Still, not moving. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat or maybe a heavy shirt. I couldn't make out his face. He was too far, and the shadows had already started to stretch. I froze. My legs were locked, my body heavy. I blinked and he was gone. I backed away from the river, not turning my back, and sat beside the fire I'd started earlier. I fed more wood into it. I sat there until it was pitch black around me, only the flames lighting the clearing. All night I kept waking up. I didn't hear him, didn't see him again, but I felt it, like I was being watched. I lay there in the dark with the knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, waiting for footsteps, waiting for a shadow to pass the tent wall. Nothing came. At dawn, I packed everything. I didn't bother with breakfast. I crammed everything into my bag and collapsed the tent in 10 minutes. I was sweating, heart pounding, checking the trees every few seconds. The walk back to the car felt like a mile. I kept thinking I'd hear him behind me, see him on the path. But the trail was empty, quiet. When I reached the car, the rear passenger door was open. I stood still for a long time, not breathing. I knew I had locked it. I checked all 4 doors when I left it. The handle had been stiff. I looked inside. Nothing was missing, but the glove box was open, and the papers inside were scattered. There was a scratch on the driver's side mirror, a deep one like it had been hit with a rock or key. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. Didn't even check my phone until I reached Allegheny, a town nearly 50 kilometers away. I pulled into a gas station, bought a drink, and sat in the lot breathing hard. I didn't go to the police. I didn't even tell anyone about it until months later. What would I say? That some man stood across the river from me? That my knife moved? That I saw a boot print? There wasn't a crime. Nothing stolen. No threats. Just wrong things. Small things. But it was real. I know it was. I never saw his face. Never heard his voice. But someone was out there with me, watching me, close enough to open my pack, close enough to get inside the car. For weeks after I got home, I kept waking up at night. I'd get up and check the locks on my doors and windows. I kept a flashlight beside my bed, my knife on the nightstand. I haven't been camping alone since. I still love the outdoors, but I stick to campsites now. The kind with families and camp hosts and bathrooms. Places with noise and light and people. Because what scared me most wasn't that there was someone out there. It was how easily he got that close without making a sound. How he never needed to do anything loud or violent. He just waited and watched, and that was enough. I was 38 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip into the hills just north of Salmon, Idaho. It was late October of 2019, and I had been needing some space. I'd been working long shifts as a mechanic in Missoula, and my nerves were shot. Hunting had always helped me reset, clear my head, and that part of Idaho had always called to me. Sparse population, endless forest, and plenty of mule deer in the colder months. I had hunted there a few times with my uncle when I was younger, but this was the first time I was heading out on my own. I packed my gear carefully, Remington 700 chambered in .30-06, a solid 2-person backpacking tent even though I was going alone, enough food for a week, a satellite communicator, a knife, first aid, water filter, and my good boots. I double-checked everything the night before I left and made sure my truck had been topped off. The plan was to drive up Route 93 until I got past North Fork, take a series of dirt Forest Service roads into a part of the Bitterroot Range that bordered the Salmon Chalice National Forest, then hike in another 3 or 4 miles to a spot my uncle had once shown me. It wasn't marked on any maps, just a basin we called the Elbow because of the shape of the ridge around it. It was quiet, out of the way, and most importantly, loaded with deer if you timed it right. I left Missoula before dawn and reached the access roads by mid-morning. It took a while to get deep enough in to where I could park without seeing any tire tracks. I always tried to avoid spots that other hunters might use. I wanted space, peace, silence. I pulled off just before a fork where an old logging trail curved up into the treeline, shouldered my pack, slung my rifle, and started walking. The hike was rougher than I remembered. The trail had eroded in places, and the underbrush had reclaimed a lot of it. I took my time, checking for signs as I climbed: scat, tracks, rubs on the trees. I spotted a couple deer tracks, but nothing fresh. The trail climbed steeply for a while before leveling out into that wide elbow-shaped basin. The trees opened up just enough to give a view of the northern ridge. The leaves had mostly dropped by then, but some of the aspens still had yellow clinging to them, and the ground was thick with dried leaves. You could hear every step crunch for yards. I made camp near a small creek at the base of the basin, a good 30 minutes hike from the trailhead. I knew the area well enough to get around, and my GPS kept a track anyway. I set up the tent just before dusk, built a fire, boiled water, and ate a freeze-dried meal with some jerky and instant coffee. The wind picked up after sundown. The fire snapped hard, and I pulled my jacket tight and just sat watching the flames while the sky turned purple, then black. No cell signal, no cars, no people. Just wind, trees, and the occasional creak of branches shifting in the dark. I felt calm, finally. The first 2 days were uneventful. I scouted the basin, followed a game trail that wound northeast, and posted up in a natural blind by mid-afternoon each day. I didn't see much. A few does off in the distance, but they weren't moving much. I figured the rut hadn't fully kicked in yet. I did find some fairly recent buck tracks down near the creek, so I decided to stick it out. By the 3rd day, I started noticing something strange. Not dangerous, just off. First, I found a spent shotgun shell near a patch of moss behind the ridge. Not unusual on its own, except it was bent and dirty like it had been jammed and tossed. No markings on it, and definitely not mine. I didn't think much of it until I came across a small, torn-up tarp about 100 yards west of my camp. It had been caught on a stump and partially buried under leaves. Not full-size, more like something someone might use for a quick shelter. It looked like it had been there a few weeks at least. I made a mental note of it but didn't touch anything. People passed through all the time. Still, it gave me that unsettled, half-watched feeling, like I wasn't the only one out here. That night, I stayed up late by the fire again. The wind had dropped, and the forest felt unusually quiet. I didn't hear the usual cracking or rustling of small animals or branches. It was like the whole place had gone still. At some point past midnight, I thought I heard a faint clatter from the ridge above, like metal on stone or something hard being knocked over. I sat still, letting my ears adjust. It didn't come again, but it kept me up longer than I wanted. I slept light that night, and when I got up at dawn, I checked around the camp just in case. No tracks, no sign anyone had come through. The only thing that seemed out of place was a set of small scratches on a nearby pine, vertical gouges about 6 feet up. Not from a bear, too clean and too narrow. Maybe someone had climbed it or used it as a marker. Either way, I was more alert than before. That day, I moved a little farther out to the southern edge of the basin. Around mid-afternoon, I spotted a buck grazing just below the treeline, and I took the shot from about 80 yards. Clean hit right through the heart. He dropped instantly. I field dressed him quickly, loaded what I could into my pack, and hauled the first load back to camp. I left the rest hanging in a tree, wrapped in game bags the way I'd always done. By the time I returned to camp, the sun had already dipped behind the ridge. I set the meat down and started another fire. While it burned, I walked back a bit to scan the woods. That's when I noticed something strange in the underbrush, almost like a path had been pushed through the leaves. It wasn't an animal trail. It looked too wide and too deliberate, almost like someone dragging something. I followed it for about 50 feet before it just ended. No blood, no clear boot prints, no broken branches, just disturbed leaves. Back at camp, I didn't eat. My stomach was tight. I couldn't explain why, but I suddenly didn't want to be there anymore. Something about that trail and the quiet in the trees felt wrong. I stayed up with the fire until it burned low, then went into the tent with my rifle close. I left my boots on. At some point deep in the night, I woke up to the sound of branches cracking. Not small ones, but thick, slow cracks, like someone stepping heavily just beyond the fire ring. I didn't move. I lay there breathing slowly, ears straining. I heard another crack, closer this time, then a silence so complete it made my heart pound. I grabbed the rifle and slowly unzipped the flap. The coals were still glowing, but barely. I couldn't see anything, just shapes in the dark. I didn't want to call out and I didn't want to flash my light, so I waited. Eventually, the sound faded and I eased the flap closed. I didn't sleep after that. When the sky finally lightened, I got out and did a full walk around the tent. No tracks, nothing disturbed, but I swear something or someone had been close during the night. I packed the rest of the deer meat, but I didn't hang around. I loaded it up and hauled the last trip back to my truck. That should have been the end of it. But when I reached the truck, I found the driver's side mirror shattered and long, shallow scratches down the length of the door. Not claw marks, more like a knife or tool. Clean, straight, deliberate. My chest went cold. Someone had been here, maybe watching, maybe waiting. I unlocked the door, checked the inside. Everything else seemed untouched. No flat tires, no signs of forced entry. But the scratches made one thing clear: whoever was out there knew where I was. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone, that this was their place too. I didn't waste time. I got the meat packed into the cooler, gear in the back, and started driving. I made it down the winding forest road with white knuckles on the wheel, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. The wind had picked up again, rattling through the trees like whispers. I didn't stop until I hit Route 93. Only then did I feel like I could breathe. Back in Missoula, I cleaned and stored the meat, but the scratches on the truck stayed with me. I couldn't explain them. I reported it to the local sheriff, gave a rough location, and said I suspected someone might have been messing with my vehicle out in the forest. They took a statement, but nothing came of it. No follow-up, no other reports from the area. A few weeks later, I started looking through hunting forums, trying to see if anyone else had experienced anything strange in that part of the woods. Most posts were typical gear reviews, trail info, game movement. But buried in a comment thread, I found a guy talking about a camp that had been trashed out near North Fork the previous year. No gear stolen, no animals touched. Just slashed tents, a bent rifle barrel, and a ring of boot prints that didn't match the campers. He never went back. I haven't either. Something was out there. Not an animal, not some legend or story, just a person. A real person who lived or hid in that stretch of forest and didn't want anyone else around. Someone patient enough to follow without being seen. Someone close enough to watch me skin a deer and mark my truck while I slept in the woods a few miles away. I don't know if they were a squatter, a drifter, or something worse, but they were real. These days, I stick closer to known areas. I hunt near friends or in places with solid signal. I still love the woods. I still love the silence. But I don't camp alone anymore. Not after that trip. Because the scariest thing out there isn't what you can't explain. It's what you can. I was 32 when I decided to take that solo camping trip in northern Minnesota. The year was 2019. It was early September, right after Labor Day, when most of the summer tourists had gone home and the air was starting to get that early autumn bite. I'd been dealing with a pile of stress at work, working long hours at a welding shop in Duluth, and after finishing a tough project, I figured I owed myself a few quiet days in the woods. I picked a spot I'd never tried before, a ridge a few miles south of Lower Red Lake. It was far off the beaten path, and I chose it for that reason. I wanted peace, just me and the trees and no one around. I'd found it through an old hiking forum online. A guy had posted about it a few years back, said it had a great view of the water and barely anyone ever hiked up that way. That was enough for me. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filters, first aid kit, matches, knife, extra clothes, and my .357 revolver. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I always took it with me when I camped alone. Not for people necessarily, more for animals, especially black bears. They're usually harmless, but you never know. The drive up took about 5 hours. I left early in the morning, just after sunrise, and by the time I parked on the edge of an old logging road, it was early afternoon. The trail wasn't marked. I followed GPS coordinates and a few notes I'd printed out from the forum. It took a while to find the trailhead. It wasn't really a trail at all, more like a faded path someone had bushwhacked years ago. But once I spotted it, I was on my way. The hike took a little over 2 hours. It wasn't too steep, but there was a lot of undergrowth, fallen branches, and thick patches of mosquitoes. I sweated hard even in the cooler air. The pack was heavy, and I had to stop a couple times to catch my breath. Still, when I reached the ridge, the view made it all worth it. The ground leveled out into a kind of clearing, a soft patch of moss and grass surrounded by tall spruce and birch trees. From the edge of the ridge, I could see a strip of red water glinting in the distance. Red Lake. It was quiet. No hum of cars, no people talking, just wind brushing through the trees and the occasional call of a distant loon. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up without issue. I laid out my sleeping bag, got my little propane stove ready, and then spent a while collecting dry wood for a fire later. Around 5, I heated up some canned chili and ate while watching the sun start to drop toward the lake. There was a strong breeze coming in from the west, and the trees swayed with it like waves. It was exactly what I'd wanted. That first night went fine. A little cold, but nothing serious. I stayed up until maybe 10, feeding the fire and staring into the dark. There was something comforting about the isolation. I felt far away from the stress, the noise, the pressure of everything back home. But the second day, things started to feel off. Not in any big, obvious way. Started small. That morning, while I was boiling water for coffee, I noticed a faint boot print a few feet from my tent. First, I figured it was mine. I checked my own boots against it. Mine were larger, size 12, and this one looked smaller, maybe a 9 or 10. Could have been from someone who camped here a week ago, I told myself. The ground wasn't damp, but it had rained a few days earlier according to the weather history, and maybe the print held. Still, it stuck in my mind. I hadn't seen or heard a soul since I got there. I shrugged it off, poured my coffee, and spent the day hiking down a slope toward the lake. Took me an hour to get there. The trees thickened as I descended, and I had to mark my way back using bits of orange tape I kept in my pack. The lake was as still as glass. I didn't see a single boat. I filled up my water bottles, filtered them, and ate a sandwich on a rock near the edge. While I was down there, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't explain why. I felt like something was watching, It wasn't anything I could prove, no sound, no movement. But the feeling clung to me, like the air was just too still. I tried to shake it, but it hung there, especially when I started heading back up. When I got back to camp that afternoon, something was different. I couldn't tell what right away. My gear was all where I left it. Tent zipped, sleeping bag inside, food tied up in the bear bag hanging from a branch, stove untouched, but something still felt wrong. I did a slow circle of the site. Then I noticed it. One of the sticks I'd arranged around the fire pit had been moved, just one. I remembered how I'd set them like a star shape to help balance my cookware. But one was out of place, pointing away from the pit toward the trees. I stared at it for a long time. Then I reset it and sat by the fire ring, trying not to think too hard. Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon had knocked it over. But I didn't believe that. That night I couldn't sleep. I laid there for hours, staring at the tent ceiling. The wind was gone. Everything was still, too still. Every time a branch creaked or a leaf fell, my pulse jumped. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, crunching steps on dry leaves. They came from the direction of the ridge. They weren't deer steps, too heavy. And not a bear. Bears shuffle and snort. This was different. Steady, careful. One foot, then the other. Someone trying to be quiet. I held my breath. My revolver was under my sleeping bag. I slowly slid it into my hand and stayed still. The steps came closer. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Minutes passed. Then nothing. Just silence. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was light out. My mouth was dry, and my back hurt from tensing up all night. I got up, walked around, and checked the area again. That's when I found the second footprint. This one was fresher, just a few feet from the tent, in the moss. Again, smaller than my boots. Clearly not mine. Someone had been there. I packed my gear slowly that morning, trying to stay calm. I still had a day left on the trip, but something inside me said it was time to leave. I kept the revolver on my hip and moved with purpose. It took me about 20 minutes to take everything down. As I rolled my tent, I found something tucked behind a tree just outside camp. A torn piece of denim, faded blue, looked like it came from a pant leg, maybe caught on a branch. It was damp and it wasn't mine. I didn't like the feeling crawling over my skin, that tight itch along the back of my neck. I started hiking out, but I didn't make it far. About half a mile down the trail, I spotted something up ahead, barely visible through the trees. A shape. I froze and crouched low. I watched for maybe 5 minutes. No movement. Then I started to circle wide, trying to stay hidden. As I got closer, I realized it was a lean-to, a makeshift shelter. It hadn't been there 2 days ago. Built from pine branches and a plastic tarp. No markings, no sign of ownership. A couple of empty cans nearby. No fire ring. No sleeping bag. Whoever had made it had done so recently, within the last 48 hours. And they were still out here. I didn't stick around. I turned back the way I came, moving fast and quiet. My heart pounded. I kept glancing behind me every few seconds. I took out the revolver and kept it in my hand the whole way. I didn't stop. Not to eat. Not to drink. 2.5 hours later, I was back at the truck. Everything looked untouched. No signs of tampering. I opened the door, threw my gear in the back seat, and drove out without even changing my boots. My hands shook the whole time. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Later that night, back home in Duluth, I couldn't sleep. My legs were still sore, and my mind wouldn't slow down. I kept thinking about the boot prints, the lean-to, the footsteps, the way everything had felt just slightly off. A few days later, I logged back into that hiking forum. The post about the ridge, gone. The guy who made it, his profile had been deleted. No trace of the coordinates, no mention of the place anywhere else on the site. I never went back. I still don't know who was out there. Maybe a hunter. Maybe someone living off the grid. Maybe something worse. All I know is I wasn't alone. And they knew I was there. Knew where I slept. Knew when I left. And for some reason, they didn't want me to find them, but didn't mind letting me know they were watching. It's been years, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear those slow, careful footsteps outside my window. But it was real. It happened, and I won't ever go camping alone again. I was 32 that summer, working construction jobs across northern Arizona. I'd been on the road for over 4 months, bouncing between contracts, trying to save up enough to put a down payment on a small place outside of Flagstaff. Work was steady but exhausting. I'd gotten used to sleeping in my truck or cheap motels, eating gas station food, and seeing my hands stay dirty no matter how many times I scrubbed them. That August, I decided to take a break. I hadn't had a proper day off in weeks, and the last few job sites were especially rough. We were pouring concrete foundations in 105-degree heat, surrounded by nothing but dry air and red dirt. So when we wrapped up a gig early near Winslow, I took off a few days early and drove north to the Chinle area. I'd heard from another guy on the crew that there were quiet spots in the high desert where you could camp alone and not see another soul for days. That's exactly what I wanted. Just a break from everything. I wasn't new to camping and I liked going alone. I always found a weird comfort in the isolation. No noise, no people, just the land. That kind of silence cleared my head. I had a full tank of gas, a case of water in the back, freeze-dried meals, my old sleeping bag, my .38 in the glove box, and a secondhand canvas tent that still smelled like mildew, even after 3 years of use. I drove west out of Chinle, then took an unmarked dirt road heading south into the desert. There were no signs or fences, just wide open country. My tires kicked up thick clouds behind me as the road turned into rocky terrain. About 45 minutes in, I pulled off near a shallow ridge with a good view of the plain below. There were old cattle trails nearby, but I didn't see any fresh tracks. No fences, no buildings, no parked cars. Just dry brush, dusty hills, and that deep, empty desert air that always feels heavier after sunset. It was perfect. I set up camp about 30 yards from the edge of the ridge. I pitched the tent facing the open plain. There were some juniper trees scattered behind me and a dry wash that ran parallel to the ridge, maybe 20 feet down the slope. I parked my truck next to the tent for wind cover. It was quiet, too quiet actually, and I remember that sticking with me. Not even the constant chirping of birds or bugs. Just that soft wind passing through the brush like it was trying not to wake anything. I spent the first few hours just walking the area, stretching my legs, collecting firewood, listening. No music, no phone, just being there. That first night was uneventful. I cooked some rice and beans over a small fire, drank 2 beers, then crawled into the tent and fell asleep to the soft groaning of wind pushing through the tent flaps. I didn't even dream. I slept deep. It was the second night when things started to feel wrong. That morning I had hiked about 2 miles down a long dry gully. I followed some deer tracks but never saw any animals. The further I went, the more I started seeing things like old fence posts, barbed wire buried under sand, and the remains of some kind of structure, maybe a shed or old homestead. Just a few rotted boards and a rusted wheel. The air out there felt old. That's the only way I can describe it. Like time just didn't move the same. I left around mid-afternoon when it got too hot to keep going. I was back at camp by 4, sweating and covered in dust. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, I started hearing what I thought were coyotes, but the calls were off. They didn't sound like coyotes I was used to. I grew up around farms in New Mexico, and I've heard hundreds of them. High-pitched, yipping, barking. But this was different. It was slower. One long howl, not quite human, not quite animal. Like someone imitating a coyote but getting the pitch just a little wrong. And then silence. No chorus of yips. Just that single, stretched out call that faded too quickly. I figured it was just an old or sick coyote. Maybe a lone one. I didn't think much of it. Not until I heard it again a few hours later, only this time it was closer. I was sitting in the truck bed watching the stars, letting my food settle. There was no fire going, just moonlight and a breeze that had picked up since sundown. Then that same howl came again, from down the wash this time. It was closer than before. I'd say maybe 100 yards out. I froze. Something about the way it ended, it didn't taper off like a real howl. Cut off sharp like it had been stopped. And then came the silence.
No crickets.
No wind. I climbed down, grabbed my flashlight, and swept the area. But there was nothing. I walked to the ridge edge and scanned the slope. Nothing moved. I felt watched, though. That old heavy feeling in your chest like something is nearby and just waiting. I slept in the truck that night with the .38 in my lap. I left the tent zipped and untouched. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up sweating. The air had gone completely still, and the temperature dropped hard. It had to be below 40. I sat up and looked out the windshield. I saw someone standing at the edge of the wash. At first, I thought it was a tree or maybe a deer, but the shape didn't move. It just stood there, tall, thin, and facing my direction. No light.
No ellesine.
Just a dark figure, barely outlined against the slope. I stayed frozen, breathing shallow, trying to keep quiet. I blinked and reached for the flashlight, and when I turned it on, the figure was gone.
No footsteps.
No sound. I didn't sleep again until the sun came up. I packed up camp the next morning, but for some reason, I didn't leave. I don't know why. Maybe pride. Maybe stupidity. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light, or my brain playing games after too many days alone. I'd driven all that way, and I wanted to finish the trip. So I set up again, but this time I kept the fire going most of the day. The smoke gave me some sense of control. That night, everything got worse. I kept the .38 on my hip. I cooked early, then stacked the firewood high, enough to last until midnight. Around dusk, I noticed the birds were back. Briefly, they scattered just as fast. As night fell, I heard something walking near the ridge. Not a coyote, not a deer. This was 2 legs, crunching slow, deliberate. Then the call came again. Same stretched out howl. But this time it was directly behind the tent. 30 feet away, maybe less. I didn't move. Then I heard it speak. Not real words, just a garbled mess. Like someone trying to form human sounds but not getting it right. It was quiet, raspy, almost like a voice that had never learned to talk. It muttered for maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. I stood slowly, holding the flashlight in one hand and the pistol in the other. When I turned the light toward the trees, there was nothing there. But I smelled something, wet, earthy, like rotting leaves or an animal left out in the sun.
I've smelled roadkill.
I've smelled dead deer after 3 days. This was worse. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the truck, windows cracked, watching the wash and the tree line. Every time I started to drift, I'd hear movement. Soft, dragging steps circling the tent. Sometimes twigs snapped. Once, something brushed the side of the truck bed. At one point, I thought I saw a face pressed against the passenger side window. But when I jumped, gun raised, there was nothing there. By morning, the tracks were gone. Not a single footprint, not a broken twig. I drove out that day. Fast. When I got back to Chinle, I stopped at a gas station to fill up and buy a coffee. I looked like hell. Mud on my jeans, red dust in my beard, eyes bloodshot. The old man behind the counter didn't say anything until I turned to leave. Then he said one thing very low. "Don't go off them roads alone. Not out there." I didn't reply. I didn't want to know more. I got in the truck and kept driving. That was 3 years ago. I haven't camped alone since. I still work the same jobs, still sleep in my truck sometimes, but I don't go out into the desert by myself anymore. And sometimes, on really quiet nights, I hear that same stretched out call in the distance. Maybe it's just my memory playing tricks, but every time I hear it, I remember standing on that ridge, flashlight shaking in my hand, and seeing a man, or something shaped like one, just watching. I don't think it was a coyote. I don't think it was a man either, but it was real, and it was out there. I had always wanted to spend some time alone in the countryside of France. Not the tourist version of France, the cities and cobblestone streets and cafes that people put on postcards, but the real part, the rural part. I was living in Lyon at the time, doing freelance IT work that allowed me to travel a bit. Most of my jobs were remote, just long hours of coding, fixing systems, and responding to emails. That summer, I told myself I needed to take a proper break from the screen. So I packed up my old Renault Clio and headed into the Parc Naturel Regional du Haut-Jura in eastern France, not far from the Swiss border. I was 33 back then. It was early September 2019, the kind of month where the air is cool in the morning but still warm by midday. I didn't tell many people about my trip, just a few close friends back home in the UK, and I dropped a quick email to a cousin in Marseille in case anything went wrong. I don't think anyone paid much attention, and I liked it that way. I wanted space, time to clear my head. No city noise, no lights, no interruptions. I had chosen a place that was marked as a wild camping-friendly area on a French hiking forum. The specific spot wasn't even labeled on Google Maps. You had to take a dirt track off the D437, follow it about 4 kilometers into the woods, and then walk another 15 minutes along an overgrown footpath that ran beside a shallow stream. It wasn't a real campsite, just a clearing surrounded by pine trees and a soft patch of grass large enough for a tent or two. The stream nearby provided water, and the whole area was dead quiet. No cell service, no man-made noise, just forest. I got there on a Thursday afternoon. The sun was bright, and the clearing looked perfect. I pitched my green decathlon tent quickly and set up a simple fire pit using a few large rocks and some dry twigs. I'd brought a small cooler with cheese, cured meat, some hard bread, and 2 bottles of water. I also had a camping stove in case I needed it, but I planned on keeping things simple. I didn't bring too much gear, just a sleeping bag, a foam mat, a knife, a flashlight, a headlamp, some batteries, and a heavy wool blanket. I wanted to live rough for a few days, just feel disconnected. The first night was peaceful. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional owl in the trees above. It got cold around 2 a.m., but I was warm inside my sleeping bag. I woke up at dawn with dew on the tent and a thin mist hanging in the trees. It was beautiful. I made a coffee on the stove and sat on a log by the fire pit, staring at the trees while I sipped it. There was no one out here, just me and the forest. The second night, something felt different. It started with the sense that I wasn't entirely alone. It's hard to explain, but anyone who's spent time outdoors alone will probably understand. That low-level tension, your brain picking up on something your eyes and ears haven't registered yet. Around dusk, I took a short walk away from the clearing, following the stream upstream to where it curved into a rockier section of forest. That's when I saw a small stack of rocks, 3 or 4, carefully balanced in a way that looked deliberate. At first, I didn't think much of it. People leave stuff like that around sometimes. But then I saw another stack about 10 meters further along. Then another, all of them neatly placed, in a line that almost followed the stream's path. There were at least 7 of them. I walked past each one slowly. None of them looked especially old. No moss on them, no leaves caught underneath. The dirt around some of the bases looked freshly disturbed. Someone had made them recently. That's when I noticed a torn piece of red fabric caught on a thorn bush nearby. It looked like it had been part of a jacket or shirt. Something about it unsettled me. I took a few photos on my old Nikon and walked back to camp. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I lay there listening to the woods. There were the normal forest sounds. Whined through branches, the occasional creak of a tree shifting, small animals moving through the brush. But then, around 1:30 a.m., I heard something that didn't belong. It sounded like soft crunching. Footsteps, not heavy ones, but slow, deliberate ones. Not an animal. I stayed still in my sleeping bag and listened, heart thudding in my ears. The steps came from the direction of the stream, then paused. For about 2 minutes, there was nothing. Then I heard a soft click-click sound, like someone lightly tapping two stones together. It happened 3 times. Then silence. I didn't move. I just waited, gripping my knife in the dark, not even daring to switch on the flashlight. I lay awake until the sky began to lighten around 5 a.m. That morning, I checked the perimeter of the clearing. I didn't find any footprints, just flattened grass in one spot near the edge of the trees. It might have been from an animal, or it might not have. I should have packed up and left right then. But I didn't. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably a hiker passing through or a fox or nothing at all. I had 2 more nights planned. I wasn't gonna run because of a few rocks and strange noises. I didn't want to believe I was in danger. That afternoon, I hiked further up the path I had taken the first day. About 2 kilometers from camp, I found an old wooden hunting blind half hidden in a patch of dense trees. It was run down, planks rotting, moss growing on the walls, but it looked like someone had been there recently. There was a crumpled can of instant coffee beside the blind, and what looked like fresh boot prints in the mud nearby. I felt a chill crawl down my back. That blind hadn't been mentioned on any of the hiking forums. I went inside. It smelled like damp wood and old cigarettes. The view from the slit in the wall overlooked the stream. You could see the clearing from there. My tent was barely visible through the trees. Someone had been watching this area. Maybe still was. I hiked back fast, glancing over my shoulder the whole time. Back at camp, I grabbed the cooler and stuffed what I could into my backpack. I knew I couldn't make it back to the car that night. It would be too dark to see the track, and the forest was thick. But I didn't want to sleep at the clearing again. I walked about 1 kilometer in the opposite direction, toward a rocky slope I remembered passing. There were a few boulders there, and I tucked myself behind one of them and set up my tent in a narrow patch of flat ground. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't want to be where I'd been the past 2 nights. That night was quiet at first. The wind had picked up, and the trees made constant whispering noises. I stayed awake with my knife and flashlight next to me. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again. A stick breaking, then another click-click sound. This time it was closer. It wasn't an animal. I was sure of that now. It was someone. I switched off my headlamp and waited. Then I saw it. A figure, about 15 meters away, just past a tree. I couldn't make out his face, but he was tall and thin. He wasn't holding a light, just standing there, watching. I held my breath, afraid to move. He didn't come closer, just stood like that for at least 5 minutes. Then he slowly turned and disappeared behind the trees. I didn't sleep. I packed everything at first light and began the hike back to the car. The path was rough and I slipped twice on wet stones. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't eat. I reached the dirt road after 2 hours, my legs shaking. When I got to my car, I found a small pile of stones stacked on the hood, just like the ones by the stream. My stomach dropped. I looked around, no one. I didn't waste a second. I unlocked the door and got in. Drove out of there as fast as the road would let me. I never went back to that part of Jura again. I don't camp alone anymore either. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I reported it to the local gendarmerie in St. Claude a day later, showed them the photos, told them about the noises and the man. They took notes but didn't seem too concerned. Said it was probably a hunter or some recluse. But I know what I saw. He wasn't passing through. He was waiting, watching, tracking. And if I hadn't moved camp that night, I think something worse might have happened. Maybe he wanted to scare me off. Maybe he was playing some twisted game. Or maybe he was planning something else entirely. Something worse. I still think about those rocks. The way he clicked them together in the dark. The way he stood so still, like he'd been waiting a long time for something. That look of patience, even though I couldn't see his eyes. The quiet, deliberate presence. No talking.
No rusin.
Just that awful stillness. I keep that knife with me now every time I go into the woods. But I don't think it would have made much difference if he had really wanted to do something. I think I was lucky. That's all. Just lucky. I had just turned 34 that spring, and after years of saying I would do it, I finally cleared a weekend to take a solo camping trip out west. I was living in southern Missouri at the time, managing to get some freelance work going that gave me the flexibility I hadn't had in years. Life was quiet. I didn't have a partner or kids. Most of my friends were scattered across the country. I thought a weekend by myself in nature would be a good way to reset, maybe even come back with a better outlook on things. I was tired of being online all the time, tired of apartment walls, tired of artificial lighting. I picked a spot outside of a small town in northern Utah. A friend from college, Scott, had gone hiking out that way the year before and told me about a lightly trafficked Forest Service road that led to a remote plateau with a view of the entire valley. He'd mentioned the area was technically part of the Uinta Mountains, but the particular ridge wasn't close to any maintained trails or campgrounds. It was just forest and rock, open space and silence. Exactly what I was looking for. Scott had camped there with a buddy and said they hadn't seen a single other person for 3 days. He sent me coordinates, and I saved them in my GPS. I left on a Friday morning in mid-June 2018. I had a decent old Subaru with all-wheel drive, enough clearance to handle rough dirt roads. I brought everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, small propane stove, cooler with dry ice and food, first aid kit, emergency beacon, the works. I'd even bought a Garmin satellite communicator since I wouldn't have cell service up there. My plan was to drive most of the way, hike the last couple of miles, and camp 2 nights. I didn't tell many people about it. Just my sister, who lived in Nebraska, and a neighbor who watered my plants while I was gone. The drive out was long, but smooth. I made it to the forest road by about 4 p.m. on Friday. The sun was still high and the sky was perfectly clear. I remember the air being so crisp it almost felt fake. The road twisted up through scattered pine and dry hills, eventually turning into gravel and then just packed dirt. It climbed higher and higher until I reached the start of the hike, a pull-off on the side of a narrow bend where the woods thickened around the ridge. I parked, locked the car, strapped on my pack, and headed up. The hike wasn't long, maybe 2 miles, but it was steep. The ridge sloped up fast, and the dirt turned to loose stone for most of the climb. By the time I got to the top, my shirt was stuck to my back with sweat and my legs were shaky, but the view was exactly what I'd hoped for. Trees stretched out below me in all directions, and past them, the mountains ran along the horizon in jagged layers. No buildings, no people, no noise. Just birds, the wind, and the occasional creak of branches moving against one another. I found a flat spot near a cluster of tall pines and set up camp. Pitched the tent, gathered some dry sticks for a small fire, and made a quick dinner from a freeze-dried pouch. It got cold fast once the sun dropped. I remember pulling on my second hoodie and sitting by the fire, staring out over the dark valley below. The stars were the clearest I'd seen in years. There was no moon, and with no city lights around, the sky looked like a dome filled with glitter. I went to bed early that night, probably around 9:30. The ground was harder than I expected, and I didn't sleep well. At some point around midnight, I woke up to a sound, like a crunching or a snap. It wasn't close. It sounded maybe a few hundred feet off in the trees. I froze, listening. It came again, a quick rustle, followed by nothing. I laid there stiff for a long time, bear spray next to my sleeping bag. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I tried not to let my imagination take over. Eventually, I must have dozed back off. Saturday morning was still and quiet. I made instant coffee and sat by the fire pit, just watching the wind move through the trees. I hiked a little along the ridge during the day, not straying too far from camp. I had that calm, heavy feeling you only get when you're alone in the woods with no timeline. Time slows down in a place like that. Everything feels sharper, more vivid. But there was also a faint feeling in the back of my mind that didn't go away all day. Not fear exactly, just a kind of awareness like I was being watched. I kept checking behind me when I walked, kept stopping to listen. I chalked it up to being by myself in a new place. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. Down the slope, maybe 40 yards from my tent, there were signs someone had been there before. A rough fire ring, just a circle of half-buried stones, and a half-rotted tarp half-covered in pine needles. It didn't look recent, but still, it wasn't on any map, and Scott hadn't mentioned another camp. I didn't think too much of it. People camp in weird places all the time. As the sun went down Saturday night, I started to get a stronger sense of unease. Not from anything specific. Nothing had happened, but something about the silence felt wrong. The birds had stopped earlier than they had the night before. The wind was still. Even the chipmunks that had darted around all day were gone. Felt too quiet. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in my bag with my eyes open, listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard the crunch of footsteps again. This time, closer. Definitely not an animal. Too steady. 2 feet, one step after another, slow. I held my breath. The steps circled to the back of my tent, paused, then continued downhill. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't grab my flashlight. I just waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. At dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest looked the same as always. But when I checked the soft dirt near the tent's rear corner, I found them boot prints. A single set. Not mine. The tread was wider and deeper, like from a heavy hiking boot. The steps came from the tree-line, circled the tent, and went back into the woods. I packed everything in less than 15 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't boil water, didn't brush my teeth. I shoved the tent into its sack without folding it. I stuffed the rest of my gear into the backpack and hit the trail. I didn't run. I didn't want to twist an ankle, but I moved fast. I kept looking back over my shoulder. The air felt thinner. Every crack of a twig made my stomach twist. It felt like I was being followed, even though I couldn't see anyone. I got back to the car by late morning. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I threw my gear in the back and drove out, tires spinning a little on the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Vernal. I sat there in the car for a long time trying to calm down. I didn't call the police. I didn't report it to the Forest Service. What would I say? That someone walked near my tent at night? That I saw boot prints? They wouldn't send a search team over that. I told myself it was probably just another camper who saw my fire or heard me walking around and got curious. Maybe they thought I was someone they knew. Maybe they got lost and were checking for help. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Whoever it was didn't try to say anything. Didn't come during the day. They waited until night. until I was asleep. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel and double-locked the door. I didn't sleep well. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about what would have happened if I'd unzipped the tent, or if I hadn't woken up at all, or if I'd stayed another night. There are places out in the woods where no one can hear you scream. That ridge was one of them. I never went camping alone again. Not once. Sometimes I dream about it. About the sound of those footsteps behind the tent. Slow, deliberate. The pause. The silence that followed. And always I wake up before I see their face. It was October 2021 when I decided to take a hunting trip alone. I was 36 at the time, working from home a lot more due to the pandemic and all that, and my head had been full of noise for months. I needed a break from screens and people, so I picked a long weekend, loaded up my gear, and drove out to northern Idaho. I'd camped and hunted a few times before, mostly with friends, but this trip I wanted to be by myself. I wanted the quiet. I drove nearly 6 hours from Spokane to a thick, remote patch of forest near Priest Lake. Not the fancy lakeside cabins or the tourist parts, but deeper up the mountain, away from cell signal and traffic. I had mapped out a few clearings on the satellite view where elk had been spotted earlier in the year. I also had a GPS device with offline maps, a solar charger, and plenty of backup batteries. I didn't take stupid risks. I parked off a logging road that looked like no one had touched it in years. Branches scraped the sides of my truck as I pulled in, and I had to chainsaw a fallen log that was blocking the path just half a mile from where I wanted to set up camp. That little detour added an hour and some sweat to the afternoon, but I liked it. That's what I came for. Just me, my tools, and the woods. I set up camp near a shallow ravine, a bit downhill from an open ridge that looked like a good spot for glassing in the mornings. I had a sturdy canvas tent, a propane heater, a cot with a thick sleeping pad, and a small wood stove I'd use for warmth and cooking. I set up a tarp for rain protection, staked down everything, and hung my food high off a pine with bare line. I even set up a motion alarm perimeter, not because I was afraid of animals, more just a habit from trips with friends. The first night was calm, cold but quiet. I remember cooking a can of chili and some rice, sitting on a folding chair by the small fire, watching the steam drift up past the lantern glow. I heard the usual forest sounds: wind, dry branches creaking, some small animals crunching through leaves, but nothing out of the ordinary. The next morning I woke up early, my breath fogged in the cold. It was still pitch black when I climbed out of the tent and brewed a pot of coffee with the stove. I strapped on my gear, rifle, binos, a thermos, emergency kit, radio, and hiked up to the ridge before first light. The air smelled sharp, full of pine and frost. I didn't see anything that first morning. No movement at all, which surprised me. The terrain looked perfect for elk. Old tracks, droppings, fresh scrapes on tree bark. I stayed up there until about 10 a.m., glassing the tree lines, listening, but nothing moved. The second day was the same. Cold mornings, silent woods. I tracked deeper along a narrow game trail that led east from camp, marked it on my GPS, and followed it for about 4 miles. I found a dry creek bed and what looked like a bedding area, but it was empty. No fresh prints. That afternoon I got back to camp and found something odd. The motion alarm I set up was turned off. Not broken, not triggered, just off. The switch was flicked to the off position. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, thinking maybe I'd forgotten to turn it on myself. But I remembered clearly testing it the night before. It had chirped when I stepped through it after hanging my food. I walked the perimeter again. Nothing was missing. No tracks, no signs of anyone. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe I'd bumped it in the dark, or the cold drained the battery. Still, I didn't like the feeling it gave me. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind had picked up and the trees groaned overhead. I kept waking up, hearing little noises that didn't belong. Snaps, scuffles, a sharp tap against the side of the tent that made me sit up fast around 2 a.m. I held my breath for a while, listening. It didn't repeat. Probably just a branch, I told myself again. Probably. By day 3, I started questioning the trip. I was tired, and I still hadn't seen any game. I climbed higher up the ridge and tried scanning the far valley, thinking maybe I just picked a bad spot. That's when I noticed something strange. On a slope about 400 yards away, I saw a shape. At first I thought it was a black bear. Big, dark, hunched over. But it didn't move like a bear. It was crouched still. I pulled out my binos and looked closer. It was a man. He was sitting low behind a boulder, dressed in dark clothes, barely visible in the brush. I wouldn't have seen him if the sun hadn't caught the lens of whatever scope he had. I saw the glint just for a second. I kept watching him for 10, maybe 15 minutes. He didn't move much, didn't look around, just sat there like he was waiting. For what, I didn't know. It spooked the hell out of me. I was miles into the forest, way off the beaten path. No hunting tags on that side of the valley as far as I knew. No reason for someone to just be crouched behind a rock, not moving. I backed away slowly and hiked back to camp the long way, using the trees for cover. I didn't want whoever it was to know I'd seen them. Back at camp, everything looked the same except the tarp above my food line was cut. Not torn, cut clean through in a straight line. The food was untouched, but the tarp was slashed neatly like someone had taken a knife to it. That was enough for me. I packed up fast. I didn't even eat. Just threw everything into the truck as quick as I could. I started the engine and drove out, bouncing down that overgrown road, pushing through brush and praying I didn't get stuck. When I finally hit the main road again, I stopped at a small ranger station about 20 miles south. I told them what happened, about the man on the slope, the motion alarm, the tarp. They were polite, but clearly didn't know what to do with the story. They took my name and the coordinates I marked and said they'd send someone up to check. That was it. I drove home that night, exhausted, my nerves shot. I kept checking my mirrors the whole way, feeling like someone was going to come speeding up behind me. But no one did. The next morning, after a long sleep and a hot shower, I checked my GPS tracker data and found the exact timestamp when I'd seen the man. I zoomed in on the slope, but it didn't show much, just trees and rocks. I didn't know what to do with that either. About a week later, I got a call from the ranger station. They said they went to the coordinates I gave, but didn't find anything. No sign of a person. No camp, no gear, no tracks. The cut tarp and switched off motion alarm? Could have been anything, they said. Maybe an animal, maybe weather. They thanked me for the report and that was it. But I know what I saw. That guy wasn't hunting. He wasn't hiking. He was watching. And I'll always believe he came to my camp at night. Maybe more than once, just to see what I had, maybe to see if I was alone. Maybe to wait. I haven't gone back since. I still hunt sometimes, but only on public land, and never alone. I keep to trails. I tell people where I'm going. I keep my phone on me and a camera recording when I sleep. People think the woods are dangerous because of bears or cold or getting lost. But sometimes it's other people. People who don't talk, don't wave, just watch. And I was lucky. I left before I found out what he wanted. I went camping alone in the summer of 2019. I was 29 back then. My name's Chris Myers. I worked in construction, lived in a rented apartment in Redding, California, and needed a break from the noise, the traffic, and the way people stared at their phones like they were afraid to be alive. I didn't want to go to a beach or visit a city. I wanted silence, trees, Dirt. I wanted something that felt real. I drove up north into Oregon, past Medford, then cut east toward a less popular section of the Fremont-Winema National Forest. It's not as tourist-heavy as some of the other parks. I had looked it up before and found a place with no real trails, just dispersed camping. A guy I used to work with mentioned it once. He said you could hike deep into the trees and not see another person for days. That's exactly what I wanted. I brought my old red Ford Ranger, a cooler full of food, a tarp, a tent, my sleeping bag, 2 knives, a small hatchet, my Glock 19, a foldable saw, and a pile of other gear I didn't end up needing. I also brought my German Shepherd, Duke. He was 7 at the time. Big dog. Calm, smart, obedient. He was the kind of dog that didn't bark unless something was really off. I parked the truck off a narrow dirt road that ran crooked between 2 ridges. The road was rough. If you didn't have 4-wheel drive, you'd probably get stuck. There weren't any signs or markers. No fences. Just a shallow rise of dirt, some old pine needles, and dry grass crushed under my tires. I hiked about 2 miles in. Duke stayed close, sniffing along tree trunks, peeing every 100 feet, his tail relaxed. The trail was barely visible, more like an animal path than anything man-made. I didn't use GPS. I marked trees with orange tape just in case, though I didn't plan to leave the general area. There was a creek a few 100 yards from my camp. I could hear it even before I set up. I found a spot under a wide pine, with thick roots rising around it like arms. The ground was flat. There were broken logs nearby I could sit on. Everything felt calm. Birds, the sound of water, the breeze in the branches above. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I set up camp slowly. Tarp first, then tent, then rolled out my bag and laid out Duke's blanket beside me. I stacked firewood, checked the perimeter, then boiled creek water on my small propane stove. That night I ate beef stew from a can, watched the sky fade orange, then blue, then black. I didn't use a flashlight unless I needed it. I wanted to let my eyes adjust naturally. The air was cool that night. My fire popped gently. Duke rested beside me, his head down, ears still alert. I leaned back on the log and looked up at the stars until I started drifting off. I woke up just after 2 a.m. I know that because I looked at my watch. Duke was standing. His body was stiff. He was staring into the trees behind my tent. No barking, no growling, just focused. The fire had burned down to embers. I sat up slowly and listened. I heard wind, insects, the creek still flowing in the distance. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see anything. Still, the way Duke was standing set me on edge. I whispered for him to come. He didn't move. I didn't have a flashlight on, but there was enough moonlight that I could see the shapes of the trees. I stood and slowly stepped toward Duke. He shifted slightly, then looked up at me like he wasn't sure what he saw out there. Then he sat down. I stood there for another 10 minutes, watching the trees. Nothing moved. I finally turned back to the tent, added a few sticks to the fire, and laid back down. Duke came in later and curled up by my side. I figured maybe he smelled a deer or a fox. Something wild but not dangerous. Still, something felt off. The next morning, I woke up at dawn, made coffee, scrambled some eggs in a small pan. The light through the trees was beautiful, soft, and slow. Duke ran around sniffing at everything like the night before hadn't happened. I did some small hikes around the area that day, followed the creek up a ways, climbed a small hill that gave me a better view of the woods. I didn't see any people, no campers, no hikers, no tire tracks or boot prints, just pine, rock, and the sound of insects buzzing in the heat. That night, I sat out by the fire again. The wind picked up a little. Not bad, just enough to move the trees. I felt more relaxed than I had the first night. I even cracked a beer and let myself feel proud that I had found such a peaceful place. It was almost midnight when I heard something behind me. Not loud, not dramatic, just one step, one crunch of dry pine needles. I froze. Duke shot up, ears back, head low. His body was tense. His eyes locked on a patch of trees directly behind my tent. I turned slowly, staring into the dark. I couldn't see anything at first. My fire was too bright. My eyes hadn't adjusted. So I stood, grabbed my flashlight, and turned it on. Nothing. The beam moved through the trees. Trunks, branches, brush. Nothing moved. But then, about 20 feet out, I saw something behind a tree. Just a shape. Person, maybe. It was too fast to see clearly. When my light hit the spot, whatever it was had already stepped behind the trunk. I called out, not with words, but a noise, like a shout, just to let whoever it was know I saw them. No response. I grabbed my pistol from the tent and held it low. Duke was growling now, low and deep, the kind of growl he didn't use for animals. I moved around the fire toward the tree line, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. "Hey!" I shouted again. "You need something?" Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. Not even the sound of someone walking away. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, waiting. My heart was pounding, but I kept the light steady. Finally, I walked back to the fire, sat with my back to a tree, facing the dark. Duke didn't relax for a long time. The next morning, I found boot prints. A few of them. Not mine. Too large. And they didn't come from the direction of the road. They came from deeper in the woods. They circled my camp. From behind the tent, past the fire pit, then off toward the creek. Whoever it was, they'd been watching me. I felt something deep in my gut then. More than fear. I felt hunted. I packed up most of my gear that morning and stashed it in my truck. I didn't leave. Not yet. But I didn't want all my supplies sitting out if someone was creeping through the trees. I kept my pistol on my hip and stayed closer to the camp that day. I built a stronger fire ring, cleaned up any trash, burned anything that could smell. I told myself maybe it was just another camper, someone curious, someone lost. But deep down, I didn't believe it. That night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I laid in the tent with Duke beside me, both of us listening. Every twig snap, every gust of wind, every night bird. 3:17 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer. I didn't move. Duke was shaking, not scared, angry. He was ready to attack. I reached for the pistol, unzipped the tent just enough to peek through the mesh. I saw a figure, human, tall, wearing what looked like a hoodie and jeans. But something was off. They weren't standing like people stand. Their back was hunched. Their arms hung low, like they didn't know what to do with them. And they were staring right at the tent. I held my breath. Then the figure turned and ran. But the way it ran made my blood freeze. The arms didn't move naturally. The legs were stiff. It looked like someone who had never run before was trying to mimic it. I jumped out of the tent with the flashlight and gun. Swept the woods. Nothing. No sound of running. No branches breaking. Just empty dark. I stayed out there until the sun came up. When I finally walked the path toward where I'd seen the figure, I found more prints. But not full ones. Just the front half. Like whoever it was walked on their toes. That's when the idea hit me. The awful idea I didn't want to believe. They were copying me. The shape, the build. The face, I thought I saw myself. I broke camp that morning. Fully. Loaded everything into the truck and drove out. Took the same road back, slow and careful. But before I reached the main road, I saw something in the side mirror. A man, standing just where the trees met the road. Not moving. Just watching. He looked exactly like me. Same jacket, same jeans, same build, same face, but his arms were too long, and he was smiling. Wide and crooked, like he'd practiced it but didn't know why. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove until I was back in Medford, stayed in a hotel, told myself I'd been too stressed, that I imagined it. But 2 days later, back in Redding, I got a call from my neighbor. He said he saw me walking around my apartment complex at 3 a.m. Only I wasn't home yet. I was still staying with a friend. I changed apartments the next month, got a better lock, stopped hiking alone. I never told anyone the full story until now, and I don't go into the woods anymore. It was September 2021 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the forests of northern Washington. I was 31 at the time, burnt out from long weeks at the warehouse job in Tacoma. I wanted nothing more than quiet, rain, and woods. I picked a place I'd never been, somewhere north of Colville, out near an old logging road that hadn't seen much use in a decade, according to a blog post I found. The area wasn't exactly marked on maps, but I liked that. I had downloaded the offline map and planned to drive down an old Forest Service road until I found a clearing to camp. I brought everything I needed: tent, sleeping pad, food, water filter, warm clothes, knife, bear spray, and even a small hatchet. Took most of the day to get out there. Once I turned off the highway, the road narrowed fast. First gravel, then dirt, then something barely resembling a road at all. The rain had started lightly in the afternoon. By the time I found a wide enough space to park my truck and hike in, it was more of a steady drizzle. There was a clearing about a quarter mile off the road, tucked behind thick fir trees and some mossy boulders. The floor was flat and soft with pine needles. You could barely hear the road from there, not that anyone would be coming down it. I set up my tent just as the light began to fade behind thick clouds. I skipped a fire. Everything was damp and heavy. I ate a couple of granola bars under the vestibule of the tent while listening to the soft patter of rain on the fly. The forest was alive but quiet.
No distant chainsaws.
No signs of other campers. Just birds calling and rain dripping. I crawled into my sleeping bag early. It was colder than I expected, low 40s maybe, and the inside of the tent smelled of damp nylon and earth. I read a few pages of a book on my phone until the battery dipped below 20%. I switched it off and lay back, letting the rain lull me into sleep. I must have fallen asleep before 10. The next time I opened my eyes, I had no idea what time it was. The rain had picked up, hard and fast, drumming against the tent like 1,000 fingertips. First, I thought it was just the rain. But then I realized I had woken up for a reason. I felt it before I heard anything. You know that feeling you get when someone's watching you, even through a wall? Like your chest tightens and your ears sort of ring? It was that kind of feeling, a gut signal. I lay still and listened. The wind had started to pick up, shaking the tent fabric. But under the wind and rain, I could hear something else. It was faint, barely audible, but it wasn't the wind. It was slow and deliberate, like steps. They weren't close, not at first, but they were getting closer, crunching slowly on wet needles and soft ground. One, then a pause, then another. Not animal movement.
No scary.
Just careful, paced steps. I sat up slowly in my bag. My breath was shallow. I didn't want to move too fast. My eyes were locked on the dark outline of the tent wall. Nothing to see. I reached slowly into my pack and pulled out the bear spray. I held it close, my thumb brushing against the safety. The steps stopped. Then silence, except the wind and rain. I waited. Nothing. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I almost convinced myself I imagined it, that it was just a branch falling or a deer. But then I heard it again, this time from a different angle. Closer, still slow, still pacing. I stayed frozen in place. The hairs on my arms stood up. I held the bear spray tighter. Then came a sound that I can still hear in my head. Even now, something touched the tent. Not hard, just a faint press of fabric near the bottom corner, like a finger running along the edge. Then it stopped again. I didn't breathe for what felt like a minute. I waited for a zipper to move, for something to slice open the wall. Nothing. Then I heard the steps again, walking away this time, slowly, fading into the trees. It didn't make sense. Who the hell would be out here in the woods in the middle of the night, in the rain, with no light? There were no campgrounds for miles, no towns for an hour, and this wasn't a place someone just stumbled on. I stayed awake until the sun started to rise. Every so often I thought I heard a snap or shift in the brush, but I never saw anything through the mesh. My heart was pounding the whole time. When light finally started to bleed through the trees, I got up and packed quickly. I didn't even eat breakfast, just shoved everything in my bag and made my way back to the truck. But that wasn't the end. As I hiked back through the wet underbrush, I saw something that made me stop.
Boot prints.
They weren't mine. Mine had a distinct waffle pattern. These were heavier, flat-soled, like work boots. They came up the same way I had walked in, but they veered off to the left about 50 yards before the clearing. Then they looped around to the far side of the tent. I followed them with my eyes. They stopped exactly where I'd heard the first sound. Then, just 20 feet away, near the base of a thick fir, I saw something else. A crushed cigarette butt, still damp, still smelling faintly of tobacco. That's when I started to feel real fear. Someone had been watching me, maybe followed me in. Maybe they were already out there when I set up, and they were close enough to touch the tent. I kept moving. When I reached the truck, I noticed something else. Mud on the driver's side door handle. It hadn't rained that hard when I arrived the day before. I remembered wiping off the door with my sleeve before I unloaded. But now it had a fresh smudge, like someone had tried to open it. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and turned the engine over. I drove faster than I should have backed down that road. The tires slipped more than once, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I went home that same day. I showered and slept with a light on for the first time in years. Weeks went by, then months. I didn't talk to anyone about it. Not at first. What could I even say? There was no crime, no injury, nothing that made it easy to report. Just the kind of fear that clings to you in quiet moments. But then something else happened. In February, I got a call from my friend Mark, who works for a private land management company up in that part of Washington. He knew I liked camping and wanted to warn me. Apparently, a game warden found an illegal hunting camp out there. Off the grid, no permits, no ID. Just a tarp, some canned food, a fire pit, and a small radio. And something else. Maps with hand-marked trails, most of them logging roads and old campsites. One of those marks was the exact area I'd stayed. Nobody ever claimed it. They think the guy moved on. Maybe farther north. Maybe into Canada. Mark didn't think much of it. Just some loner living in the woods. But when he told me that, everything fell into place. That wasn't some lost hiker that night. That was someone who knew those woods better than I did. Someone who followed me in and watched me sleep. I still camp, but never alone. And never without double-checking the ground for prints before I set up. I was 34 years old the summer I decided to spend a week alone camping in Oregon, somewhere deep in the woods outside Gales Creek. It was 2019. I had just left a job I hated and wasn't ready to jump into another office so soon. I needed space, time to think, a reset. I'd done some camping in the past, mostly short trips, but this time I wanted something more isolated.
No campgrounds.
No marked trails, just me, a tent, some food, and the woods. I had a friend who used to hunt in the Tillamook State Forest, and he told me about a spot you could only reach by hiking in a couple miles off a rough logging road that was mostly forgotten now. He'd marked it on a paper map once, and I remembered it years later when I went searching for somewhere quiet. I took my old Subaru out there with my gear in the back, drove along Highway 6 until I turned off onto a narrow gravel road that got bumpier and less traveled the farther I went. No cell service, no other cars, just trees and dirt and the occasional sound of my tires crunching over loose stone. Eventually, the road got so bad I had to park. I threw on my pack, made sure I had my knife and bear spray clipped to my belt, and started walking. It took about an hour and a half of slow, careful hiking, moving around fallen logs and brush, before I reached the spot my friend told me about. It was a flat clearing above a small creek, surrounded by tall Douglas firs. Sunlight filtered through the trees in strips, and the only sound was water trickling over rocks. It was perfect. I set up my tent on the highest ground I could find, not far from the creek but safe in case of rain. I got a little fire going, cooked some freeze-dried chili on my tiny stove, and settled into the silence. That first night was calm, cool air, stars. I stayed awake a while, reading a paperback by headlamp, then crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off. The next morning, I explored the area around the clearing.
No trals. No litter.
It felt untouched. I followed the creek downstream for a bit, then turned back when the slope got too steep. I took photos of moss-covered rocks and a giant tree that had fallen decades ago and now hosted a whole ecosystem on its bark. By late afternoon, I started hearing something, distant at first, just a rhythmic thud, like wood knocking on wood. I figured it was a branch falling or an animal knocking something loose, but it kept happening. Sometimes once every few minutes, sometimes in bursts, always far away. I'd pause and stare into the trees, listening. Then it would stop, and I'd hear nothing but wind and birds again. That night, I built a slightly larger fire. Not because I was scared, but because something about that sound unsettled me. I'm not the type to get spooked easily, but the knocking felt out of place, like it didn't belong in a place that quiet. I stayed up late that night listening. Around midnight, it stopped completely. No more knocking. I fell asleep eventually. The next day was cloudy and cooler. I went farther upstream and found an old fire ring, rocks in a circle blackened with soot. I hadn't seen it the day before. It was covered in leaves and had moss creeping up the sides of the rocks. But it wasn't that old. Maybe a year or two. Nearby, I found a rusted folding chair collapsed under a tree. The fabric was shredded and the frame bent, like someone had just left it there. I didn't think much of it at the time. People came through these woods, even if rarely. Hunters.
Campers.
Nothing weird about that. That evening, I went to get water from the creek and noticed something that hadn't been there before. Muddy footprints along the bank.
Bare footprints.
Human. Not big, not small either. Just average-sized, maybe like mine. But I hadn't taken my boots off once since I got there. I followed them with my eyes. They came out of the woods, walked along the bank, then disappeared again into the trees. I stood still for a long time, just listening. No sound. I went back to my camp and checked all my gear. Nothing was missing. My food was still there, untouched. But I had this prickling feeling at the base of my neck, like I was being watched. I didn't build a fire that night, just stayed in my tent with my headlamp off, listening. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd think I heard something. Footsteps, branches snapping. I told myself it was probably an animal. I waited until morning and got out of the tent. Everything looked normal. I made coffee and oatmeal, trying to act like nothing was weird. But I knew I couldn't ignore the footprints. I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up slowly, stuffing gear into my pack and checking all around the site for anything else out of place. I was halfway through rolling up my sleeping pad when I saw it. Tied to a tree just beyond the clearing, about 10 feet up, was a small strip of cloth, bright red. It stood out against the green and brown around it. I walked over and looked closer. It was a torn piece of flannel. Looked like it had been tied there on purpose. No other cloth around. Just that. I left right then. I started hiking back, and maybe 10 minutes in, I got that feeling again, that crawling, watching feeling. I stopped and looked behind me into the trees. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I turned and kept walking. I walked faster than before. I started hearing things again. Not the knocking this time, just faint rustling behind me, like something moving parallel to my path. I'd stop and it would stop. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I reached the old logging road and nearly jogged the last stretch to my car. When I got there, I tossed my pack in the back and slammed the door. Before I even started the engine, I looked back up the trail I came from, and there he was, standing at the edge of the trees. A man, mid-40s maybe, dirty clothes, pale skin. I could barely make out his face, but I knew he was looking straight at me. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there maybe 20 yards away. I drove out of there so fast I almost ran off the road twice. When I finally had cell service again, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for nearly an hour before I could even think clearly. I didn't call anyone. What would I say? There was no crime, no proof. Just a man in the woods who left bare footprints, watched me for days, and never said a word. I never went back there. I never will. A month later, out of curiosity, I searched around online to see if anything had ever happened near that area. There wasn't much. Just an old forum post from 2013 about someone hearing weird knocking sounds while camping west of Gales Creek. That was it. It doesn't sound like much. I know that. A few sounds. A guy standing in the woods. But when you're alone out there, miles from anyone, no help, no signal, that kind of thing gets under your skin. And the part one think about the most, the part that makes me sick when I remember it, is that the man never needed to do anything to scare me. He just had to be there, quiet, watching. That's enough. I camp now with friends, always somewhere busy. I still love nature, but I don't go deep into the woods alone anymore. Not because of bears or cougars or even the weather. I don't go because I know what it feels like to be watched by someone who has no reason to be there. Someone who doesn't want to be found, and who, if he'd wanted to, could have done anything, and no one would have ever known. It was late October 2013, and I still remember the cold in my bones even now. I was 32 then, working in an industrial maintenance team based out of eastern Pennsylvania. Our group was tight. 6 guys who had spent years traveling across counties fixing large machinery for remote plants and old facilities. Every year, we'd take a week off together and go camping. It was a way to unwind, stay close, and get away from the hum of machines and metal. We'd started doing it years ago, and by 2013, we were already on our 6th or 7th trip. That year, Travis suggested we go deep into the Allegheny National Forest. He'd read about a stretch of remote forest near Kane where there were almost no marked trails, just logging roads from decades ago and some old hunting cabins that had been long forgotten. The idea was to go further off-grid than usual, set up near a creek, and spend 4 or 5 days there. No phones, no GPS, no schedule. Our team that year was me, Travis, Luis, Joel, Benny, and Rick. All of us had solid camping experience. We weren't soft. We packed light but smart freeze-dried food, water filters, first aid, cold weather gear. Guns too. Not just for show. It was bear country. We split the weight among our packs and took one of our company's trucks as far as the old service road would go before loading everything onto our backs and walking the last few miles in. The hike in took us about 4 hours. The woods out there felt ancient, Pines thick as pillars, old-growth trees packed tight, and a forest floor that was soft and silent underfoot. It was beautiful, but not in a friendly way. More like something that didn't really care about you. You could feel that once you got deep enough. We found a good flat area near a narrow creek, far off from any established trail. A low hill sheltered one side, and the trees opened enough to give us a clear view of the sky without being exposed. We cleared the ground, pitched our tents, built a stone ring for the fire, and got camp set up. That first night was quiet, just cold wind and the sound of water trickling nearby. The next day we split up to explore the area. We kept our handheld radios on and stayed within a 2-mile radius. Mostly we just wandered. Rick spotted some old deer stands rotting high in the trees. Joel found what looked like a rusted-out hunting shack about 1.5 miles east of camp. He said it was basically falling apart, just walls and a collapsed roof with animal scat all over the inside. He took a photo and showed us back at camp. That night it got colder. You could feel the temperature dip fast after sunset. We cooked a hot meal and sat around the fire until the wood ran out, then zipped into our sleeping bags and tried to get some rest. That night was when things started to feel different. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I got out of the tent, put on my boots, and walked just a few yards out into the woods. I kept my flashlight low so I wouldn't blind myself, and when I looked up, I saw something I didn't like. Not dangerous, just strange. There were drag marks in the pine needles, like something heavy had been pulled across the ground. It looked fresh. No leaves had settled back over it. It wasn't an animal path. I followed it with the light for a bit until it veered sharply downhill toward the creek. Then I turned around and went back to the tent. The next morning, I brought it up with Travis and the others. We chalked it up to a fallen log or maybe a deer carcass being dragged by a predator, but I could tell it made some of the guys uncomfortable. We spent the third day doing some light hiking and cutting more wood for the fire. Around noon, Joel and Luis went back to the old shack to get better photos. They had this thing about documenting old abandoned buildings. They took one of the radios and we heard from them once just to check in around 1:30. After that, it went quiet. No more radio contact. By 3 o'clock, Travis got uneasy and decided to head out after them. He told me and Rick to stay at camp while he and Benny took the second radio and followed the trail. They were gone for over an hour. When they came back, they were white-faced and tight-lipped. They didn't talk right away, just stood by the fire rubbing their hands together. Then Travis told us what happened. He said they found the shack and Joel and Luis weren't there, but it looked like someone had recently been inside. Not just them, someone else. The floor had fresh boot prints, much larger than ours. There were broken twigs, a pile of feathers, and a coat Joel had been wearing, folded and left on a stump. No blood, no sign of a struggle, just wrong. We all looked at each other. Rick started pacing. The sun was already dropping behind the trees. We decided to leave camp intact but packed our day packs and flashlights and went out in a group of 4 to search in a wider arc around the shack. We split into 2 pairs. I was with Rick. The woods out there got dark fast. The light faded from gray to black within an hour. We didn't find anything except a set of faint prints that led deeper northeast. They were wide, boot style, and deep. Whoever made them was heavy. Rick and I tried to follow them, but the ground turned rocky and we lost the trail. We called out on the radios but got no reply. We got back to camp just after nightfall. Still no sign of Joel or Luis. Their gear was all still at camp. Packs, jackets, food, everything. That made no sense. That night, we built the biggest fire we could and kept watch in shifts. I didn't sleep. I sat with the shotgun across my lap and stared into the trees. Couple times I thought I heard something. Branches snapping in slow sequence. Not from animals running through, but like something steady was walking and trying not to make noise. Travis heard it too. He looked at me across the fire and nodded slowly. At first light, we decided to hike back to the truck, drive to town, and report them missing. We left everything at camp and started moving. It was a brutal, silent walk. No one talked. We felt watched the whole time, like something was keeping pace behind the trees. When we got to the truck, we found the driver's side mirror cracked and turned inward, like someone had pushed it. There were smudges on the glass, long streaks like dirt-covered fingers. That was it. We drove into Kane and reported what happened. The rangers and local sheriff took it seriously, especially after we showed the photos and the GPS coordinates of the shack. A search team went out that day, and we waited in town, huddled in a diner, drinking coffee none of us wanted. They found Joel and Luis the next day. Both of them were alive, but they weren't right. They were picked up walking along an old service road 10 miles north of where they were last seen. No memory of how they got there. Luis had bruises along both arms and a torn lip. Joel was barefoot and had a deep gash across his right palm. Neither could speak properly for a while. They just stared and shook. After medical treatment and some time, Joel finally explained what little he remembered. He said someone was living in those woods, not in the shack beyond it. A man, huge and silent, who watched from the trees. No words, no sound, just presence. He said they were walking back to camp when they got separated, and then it was like they couldn't find the way. No matter how far they walked, they were going in circles. Luis fell and got hurt, and Joel tried to carry him, but he blacked out. When he woke up, it was daylight and they were near a dirt road. The rangers did a second search, this time with dogs, and found an old, buried hunting shelter half dug into the side of a hill about 2 miles from the shack. Inside were bones, animal mostly, deer skulls, bird bones, squirrel skeletons, but also clothes, human clothes, tattered, stained, faded from age. Some were children's sizes. There were knives, dull and rusty, and a single cot made from bundled branches and animal hide. Whoever had been living there was gone. They called off the search after that. Told us it was likely some survivalist or hermit that had been out there for years. No official statement. No warning signs put up. Just a quiet note in the report and a suggestion that hikers stay near marked trails. We never went camping again after that. To this day, we don't know who he was or how long he'd been watching. We don't talk about it much. Joel moved out west. Luis never went back to work. The rest of us stayed close but changed somehow. We stick to cities now, to people and roads and noise. Sometimes I still think about the drag marks I saw in the dark. The smudge on the mirror. The prints that led into the rocks and vanished. I think we got lucky. We left when we did. If we had stayed one more night, if we had gone further into the woods looking for answers, I don't think I'd be here writing this. I think we got too close to something that didn't want to be found, and it let us leave, but just barely.